In May 1968, France saw what would be one of the most extraordinary sets of protests that any modern nation may have seen, up to the Arab Spring. What they saw was a quarter of the entire nation taking part in extraordinary demonstrations around acts the government, corporate, schools, universities, all sorts of elements of the larger power structure were taking, and the people refused to accept it. For weeks, they fought. For weeks, they chased Charles de Gaulle, the president himself, out of the fucking country. And then nothing. It did nothing. It did nothing in the long run. Ultimately, at best, it was called a social victory, but it certainly was not a political one. We today are not in a drastically dissimilar place. A lot of us have spent the last decade going in and out of what was supposed to be the next big social movement, from Bernie trying to take on the Democratic Party, which he wasn't, to BLM, which was trying to change how police did anything, to which they didn't, to the protests of students against what was happening in Palestine and Israel. None of these yielded change. None of these yielded action. And we find ourselves lost again. There have been a lot of commentators, most notably a friend of the channel, President Sunday, who today even made the comment that he's done being part of what he sees as this online terrible left culture that is eating itself alive constantly, that is finding ways to make leadership out of the worst of us, and that somehow is still unable to do a fucking thing politically. He's not wrong, but this isn't new. Felix Guattari, following the 1968 riots and protests, wrote a piece, put pen to paper, of what I think is one of, if not the most powerful, interesting, and comforting thoughts of what is happening and what happened then. I want to do a reading of it because there's nowhere online that I could see that this had happened. And it's a piece that a lot of people look by, not only sadly because he's the lesser considered of the Deleuze and Guattari duo, but because there's just not a lot of people spending time on his works. Groupuscules is published as the final essay in Transversality and Psychoanalysis, a collection of pieces that's also just another one of his collection of pieces. But it's an incredibly powerful statement about where we are, where we will be, and really for us to take a moment to think about how change might occur. To agitate is to act. We could care less about words. We want actions. It's easy to say, especially in countries where the material forces are increasingly dependent on the technology of machines and the development of science. Overthrowing Tsarism required bringing tens of millions of the exploited masses together, mobilizing them against the brutal, repressive machinery of society and a Russian state. It meant making the masses aware of their irresistible force against the weakness of their class enemy, a weakness that was revealed and proven in that struggle for power. But for those of us in wealthy countries, things are simply different. We may have to face more than just a paper tiger. The enemy has infiltrated everywhere. It has spread out a vast petite bourgeois interzone to attenuate class contours as much as possible. The working class itself has been deeply infiltrated, and not only through company unions, treasonous parties, social democrats, and revisionists. It's also infiltrated by participating materially and unconsciously in the dominant system of state monopoly, capitalism, and bureaucratic socialism. First, material participation on a global scale. The working classes of economically developed countries are objectively involved, be it only by the growing gap in the relative standard of living and the international exploitation of former colonies. Then there is the unconscious participation in many different ways. Workers more or less passively endorsing the dominant social models, attitudes, and mystifying value systems of the bourgeois, scourges of theft, sloth, disease, and more, reproducing on their own alienating institutional objects like the conjugal family and the intrafamilial repression between the sexes and age that it implies, or becoming attached to their nation with its inevitable aftertaste of racism, without mentioning regionalism and idiosyncrasies of all kinds, professional, syndical, sports-related, etc., and all the other imaginary barriers that are artificially raised between workers, such as the ones that are particularly visible in the large-scale organization of the market of sports competitions. From a very young age, and if only because they learned to read on the faces of their parents, the victims of capitalism and bureaucratic socialism are consumed by unconscious anxiety and guilt, which represent one of the essential parts that keep the system of individual self-subjection to production in working order. Internal cops and justices and judges are even more effective than those of ministries of interior and justice. Achieving this result depends on developing a heightened antagonism between an imaginary ideal, which is taught to individuals by means of a collective suggestion, and a completely different reality that's waiting for them just around the corner. Audiovisual suggestion and mass media, they work like a charm. It leads to a deranged promotion of a maternal, familial, imaginary world crisscrossed by so many masculine values. These tend to repudiate and demean the female gender with another layer, promoting some ideal of mythical love, magic comfort, and health to mask the negation of finitude and death. Ultimately, it is a system of demands that perpetuates the unconscious dependence on a system of production. This technique we call incentives. The result of this work is the serial production of individuals who are as poorly prepared as possible to face life's most important trials. Helpless, they face reality alone, without options, mired in a stupid morality and imposed ideals they simply cannot escape. They're made fragile, vulnerable, ready to grab hold of any institutional garbage prepared to accommodate them. School, hierarchy, army, learning fidelity, submission, modesty, a taste for work, family, nation, their union, many more. Their entire life now poisoned to one degree or another by the uncertainty of their conditions regarding the process of production, distribution, and consumption, concerned over their place in society and the place of their companions. Everything now becomes a problem, a new birth, or, well, it's not working out well at school, or the older ones are bored and playing around. Illnesses, marriages, housing, vacations, everything is a pain. A minimum amount of climbing up the pyramid of relationships of production then becomes inevitable. No need to draw a picture or give a lesson. Unlike young workers, activists from a student background who go to work in a factory are guaranteed to find something else if they get fired. Whether they want to or not, they cannot escape the potential that marks them with a hierarchical place that could be much better. A truth for workers is a de facto and almost absolute dependence on the machine of production. Desire is crushed, except in its residual or standardized forms. Well-intentioned or activist desire, or drugs, these become a refuge, if not madness or suicide. Who will show the percentage of work-related accidents that were really unconscious suicides? Capitalism can always arrange things and smooth them over locally, but for the most part, and essentially everything, has become increasingly worse. In 20 years, some of us will just be 20 years older, but humanity will have almost doubled in size. If the experts are correct, the Earth may reach 5 billion inhabitants by 1990. This may cause a few more problems along the way, since no one and no thing is capable of preparing or organizing anything for these new arrivals, except for a few dreamers in international organizations that still have not resolved a single important political problem in the 25 years of their existence. It seems clear many things are going to happen in the coming years. Things of all kinds, covering the whole spectrum. Yes, revolutions, but also the horrors of fascism and its ilk. What should we do? Wait and see? Start acting? Okay, but where? What? How? Pick one thing at random. It's just not that simple. The response to many actions has been predicted, organized, and calculated by the machines of state power. I'm convinced all of the possible variants of another May 1968 have already been programmed on a IBM PC. Maybe not in France because they're too poor and somehow at the same time too well paid to know that this kind of foolishness is not a guarantee and that nothing serious has been found to replace the armies of cops and bureaucrats. In any case, it is time for revolutionaries to re-examine their programs. Some of them are really starting to show their age. It's time to abandon all triumphalism. It should be written almost with a double L. And notice that not only are we up to our necks in shit, but shit has penetrated each one of us and every one of our organizations. Class struggle no longer occurs along a clear boundary between proletariat and bourgeois that can easily be seen in cities and towns. It's also written in the countless scars on the skin and the lives of the exploited by marks of authority, rank, and standards of living. It has to be deciphered from the different vocabularies they use, their manners of speaking, car brands, their fashions, and etc. It's endless. Class struggle has contaminated the attitudes of teachers with their students, parents with their children, doctors, and their patients. It reached inside each of us with our ego, with the ideal standing that we think we have to attribute to ourselves. It's time to organize at every level to confront this generalized class struggle. It is time to develop a strategy for each of these levels because they affect each other. What would be gained, for example, by offering the masses a program of anti-authoritarian revolution against the little bosses and the like, if the militants themselves still carry the overactivated bureaucratic virus, if they still act like utter bastards or perfect Catholics with the militants of other groups, within their own group, with their friends, or even on their own. What good is it to confirm the legitimacy of the aspirations of the masses if we deny desire wherever it rears its ugly head in daily life? Shrewd politicians, they're out of touch with reality. They think that we must do away with all of our concerns in this domain to mobilize its energy for a general political objective. It's wrong. In the absence of desire, energy eats away at itself in the form of symptoms, inhibitions, anxieties. And yet, they've had enough time and opportunity to realize this themselves. Investing the energy capable of modifying the relationships of force is not something that will simply drop out of the sky. It does not emerge spontaneously from the right program or the pure science of theories. It's determined by transforming biological energy libido onto the objectives of social struggle. It is just too easy to reduce everything to these famous main contradictions of old. It's too abstract. It's a defense mechanism, something that helps us to develop group fantasies, structures of misunderstanding, a bureaucratic trick, taking cover behind something that's always behind, always somewhere else, always more important and never within reach of an immediate intervention by those involved. It's the principle of the just cause. This makes people swallow every one of those dirty tricks. The small-scale bureaucratic perversion, the petty pleasure they take in imposing themselves on you for a good cause. People that piss you off. They force you to take purely sacrificial and symbolic actions that no one gives a fuck about, starting with the masses themselves. It is a form of sexual satisfaction diverted from normal objectives. This type of perversion would have no importance if it was aimed at something other than revolution. There are plenty of other objects. The trouble, that's that these monomaniacs of revolutionary leadership, with the unconscious complicity of the base, they succeed only in miring militant investment in particularist impasses. This is my group. This is my belief, my newspaper. We are right. We follow our own line. We exist against that other line. We are a small collective identity embodied in this local leader. We didn't go through this in May 68. Everything was more or less well until the spokesperson of this or that, once they began to reemerge on the scene, as if words need spokespeople to carry them. They carry themselves very well and with incredible speed when they are true. The work of revolutionaries is not to carry words, to have things said, to transport or transmit models and pictures. Their work is to tell truth where they are, no more, no less, without exaggeration, and without tricks. How is this truth to be recognized? Well, it's very simple. There's a way that works every time. Revolutionary truth is something that just doesn't piss you off. Something you want to be involved in that takes away your fear, that gives you strength, that makes you ready to go full tilt, no matter what, even if it kills you. We saw the truth at work in May 68. Everyone understood it right away. The truth is not theory or organization. Theory and organization, they only get involved after truth appears. They always find their way in, happy to take things over, even by deforming them or lying. Self-critique, that's always for theory and organization, not desire. The question is now the work of truth and desire everywhere where things collide, inhibit each other, get bogged down. De facto and de jure groupuscules, communes, gangs, and everything else on the left have as much analytical work to do on themselves as they do political work to do outside themselves. If they don't do it, they always risk falling into the madness of hegemony, the obsession with greatness that makes some dream of rebuilding the party of Maurice Thérèse or Lenin, Stalin, or Trotsky. Each one as boring and irrelevant as Jesus Christ or de Gaulle or any of the others who never stop dying. Each one has its own little annual congress, its own central committee, its big Politburo, its secretariat or secretary general, career militants who have organized seniority and, maybe in the Trotskyist version, everything doubled on an international scale. Yes, we'll have a World Congress, an International Executive Committee, an International Secretariat, and more. Why don't groupuscules multiply infinitely instead of eating each other? A groupuscule for everyone. In each factory, in each street, each school, finally, the reign of core committees. These groupuscules, however, would accept to be what they are, where they are, and, if possible, a multiplicity of groupuscules. They would replace the institutions of the bourgeoisie. Family, school, unions, sports clubs, more. Groupuscules that would not be afraid, along with their objectives for revolutionary struggle, to organize themselves, to ensure the material and moral survival of each one of their members and of all of the lost souls around them. Then, well, anarchy. No coordination, no centralization, no headquarters, just the opposite. Take the weathermen in the USA. They are organized in tribes and gangs or other things, but It doesn't prevent them from coordinating and doing it well. What changes if the question of coordination is not between individuals, but between basic committees, these artificial families or communes? The model of the individual by the dominant social machine is too fragile, too open to types of suggestion, drugs, fear, family, and more. In a basic group, a minimum of collective identity can be retained without megalomania, with a system of control at hand. Then the desire in question may be in a better position to speak or fulfill its militant commitments. First, respect for private life, that needs to be abandoned. It's the beginning and end of social alienation. An analytical group, a unit of desiring subversion, it has no private life. It is turned inside and out towards its contingency, its finitude, towards the objectives for which it is fighting. The revolutionary movement must therefore build a new form of subjectivity that no longer relies on the individual and this conjugal family. Subversion of the abstract models exuded by capitalism, which continue to be supported by most theorists, is the absolute precondition for re-engaging the masses in revolutionary struggle. For the moment, it is of little use to draw up plans for what the society of tomorrow should be. Production, state, no state, party, no party, family, no family. When in truth, there is no one to serve as a support for utterances about them. Utterances that will continue to float in the void undecidable as long as collective agents of enunciation are not ready to explore things in reality, as long as we have no means to step back from this dominant ideology that sticks to our skin, which speaks of itself within us, which leads us to commit the most stupid acts and repetitions despite ourselves, and tends to make it so we are always beaten on the very same beaten paths.